Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Our topic will be the illusion of control indirect spend, a paper we've just put out recently. My name is Adi. I am director with Efficio based in our German office in Düsseldorf. I'm working mostly with manufacturing clients, often also PE-backed on procurement transformation, procurement optimizations, and indirect spend is a very interesting topic again and again, and especially I think also this time of the year. So maybe to just briefly summarize our paper that we have put out, and then we will get into the discussion. So for me, this is really a topic I found coming back to repeatedly when working with clients across industries. One of the things that really fascinates me about indirect spend that almost every leadership team believes that they are managing it well. Until we then really start looking into data, getting into more details, this is when things start to unfold. So the research we have put out shows that only a fifth, so to be exact, 90% of leaders are confident they have an accurate picture of the indirect spend, and over 90%, to be concrete, 93% say maverick buying is a major source of leakage. So even the most mature and sophisticated organizations struggle with this fragmented indirect categories, diffuse ownership, and the lack of this data transparency. As advisors, we see firsthand how this small cracks can add up and result in big leakages if not addressed in a systematical and structured way. And that's why I'm really delighted to be joined by Richard today. Richard's perspective is incredibly valuable because he has lived these challenges inside large and complex organizations. He knows how direct spend at Greene King was spread across the wide base of suppliers and spend types, and how that complexity required somewhat a deliberate approach to governance and control. So before we start the conversation, I'll just give Richard an opportunity to introduce himself, and then we'll get right in.
Yeah, thanks, Adi, and good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well. So, as Adi said, I just come from Greene King, where I retired this year as the Chief Financial Officer. But my background over the last sort of 35 years or so is primarily in consumer-facing businesses, both in the UK and overseas, in both manufacturing, in B2B, to C and B2C, but also in retail, so both food and non-food retail, and more latterly in hospitality. Interesting addition to that, I've also had a series of non-executive jobs across the years, which have ranged from financial services, charity, education, and I'm currently audit chair of an edtech business in the UK called RM. So I've been around the houses a few times, and I think what makes this particularly important topic for me, I've seen it from both sides of the equation. So I've been a CFO for over 20 years in a variety of different businesses. But over the last 10 years or so, I've also had direct accountability for procurement in one way or another. So in my Mothercare days, so going back 8, 9, 10 years ago, I had direct accountability for indirect expenditure, so very relevant to this topic. And more latterly in Greene King, I've had the full procurement responsibility for everything that was consumed in the businesses, from food, drink, indirect spend, and services. So I've kind of seen it from both the, let's call it the gamekeeper, so the accountant, but also not quite the poacher, but the kind of the operational procurement side. I've also had P&L accountability as well, so I've also been a consumer and spender of products as well. So this is kind of dear to my heart, and I think there are significant opportunities in this area to really create value for organizations.
Thanks, Richard. So today we'll explore where this illusion of control actually comes from, why it persists, and what we can really do about it to bring clarity, discipline, and optimize indirect spend in the end. So I think you already started touching upon it a little bit, but what I would like to maybe start the discussion with today, Richard, is your view on why indirect spend so often slips under the radar, maybe as a first overall theme.
I think it's interesting. So when you look at most businesses, and you know, every business is different, isn't it, in terms of its structure and the way in which it consumes goods and services. most organizations, certainly scale organizations, do a really great job on their direct cost of goods. They go out and they know what they're buying and they procure it really well. If they have labor costs, they know their labor costs, they manage them really tightly. And as a result, there is a presumption that if you're doing really well managing your COGS and you're doing really well managing your labor and maybe your property-based cost if you have taxes, the rest of it must be okay, mustn't it? Because it all must follow the same route. And therefore, there sometimes is a belief, a false belief that, if you're doing well on 80%, the 20% must be pretty good. I think also there's a focus point. So sometimes it's easier not to go digging in something which is hard to do. And we all know probably this call that indirect spend can be quite hard to get at. And we're going to come on to that later in the conversation. And therefore, maybe just persuading yourself it's in control, it's okay, we know what's going on, means that actually you don't really have to worry about it. And I think that's where the opportunity lies, really, to create value.
No, I agree, and this is what we see as well. When we maybe look at some let's say feedback from the paper that we have seen there. For example, the study shows that only a fifth of leaders feel they have a really accurate picture on the indirect spend. Is that something that surprised you, or does it somewhat mirror what you have also experienced, or what you also see with peers along the way?
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. I think, most organizations, to my earlier point, spend lots of time categorizing, classifying, recording their major items of spend. And it's done in a very, very consistent way. And when ERP systems are set up, so the accounting reporting systems, they focus very, very heavily on making sure those areas, because they're the big items, are clearly understood and clearly defined. You don't often see the same discipline because it's at the end of the process, particularly in ERP system implementations, where you apply the same disciplines. As a consequence, it results in a lack of transparency. And it's actually quite difficult because, to define labor is pretty clear, it's pretty straightforward. To define what could be thousands of lines of indirect spend is actually quite hard and quite challenging, and it is more contentious because you have different perspectives, and as a consequence, you don't get the system set up usually correctly at the start to manage that.
No, I agree. I was also not surprised, let's say, when looking back at it, but it always is a difference seeing it really then on paper than just having it as a feeling. Because in the large organization that I've worked with, indirect spend very often turned out to be broader and more complex than people initially thought. Even where processes are strong, you have somewhat good data quality. Data quality is always a beast on its own, but even if if you only have some coding inconsistencies, you still have very often, especially in the manufacturing sector with different plants, what I see very decentralized buying behaviors, and the complete view. So I think 90% feels, say, honest, and maybe even depending on the more I think of it, maybe even a little optimistic. Let's put it that way. So moving on maybe to topics like I touched upon already, data, strategic alignment, and visibility. Do you maybe have a real-world example, or can you share where a real-world example where improved visibility really made a meaningful difference?
Yeah, so I think going back to that earlier point about setup, although it's hard, if you apply effort to working through your total area of spend, and one of the things that sometimes gets in the way is this whole concept of addressable versus non-addressable spend. And therefore, if it's non-addressable, why bother? But actually, all spend is addressable. And I say that with a degree of experience. So it may not be addressable immediately, but over the long term, all spend is addressable in some way, shape, or form. So it's worth the effort to go through and define your systems. Typically, I've done that with the business owners and the procurement teams. So defining the areas of spend really clear and actually mapping all spend. And actually, ultimately, a good CFO will understand what comes in the door through revenue, what goes out the door through profit and through cash. And therefore, as a consequence, if you apply effort, you can break down the spend into its constituent bits and buckets. The challenge is to take it really from an objective, centralized point of view. So, I'll give you a very silly example, Andy, but this is an example I've come across in the past in an organization. So it was a very small area of spend, small in the context of the overall spend of the business. This was in a global retailer, but it was still ranking towards hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. So, and this was to do with stationery. So, you know, we had a program to look at how we could improve our overall spend controls across the business globally, and I was given that task of doing this going back some years, and as I dug into it, what I found remarkable was, and this will sound very odd, pens. We had 17 classification of pens in the organization, 17, and basically, they're all biros of a description, slightly different size, slightly different shape, but they're all biros. And as a result, you had no visibility because everybody classified it differently. And it was all called something different. It wasn't called pen. Some was blue biro, some was blue biro with frilly top. And so taking a hard measure to classify things centrally, first did two things. Firstly, expose the size of the spend because previously it was all very, very small. When you did it all together, it became very big, very, very quickly. And then secondly, it allowed you just to challenge what that item in this case was being used for by who. And actually what you worked out very quickly was there'd been no deliberate intent to buy 17, 18 pens. Nobody gone out there deliberately to try and create their own pen armada. It just been people wanting a pen and not knowing the process or the systems and setting one up somewhere because they could, negotiating it locally from a local supplier. And as a consequence, didn't really change the customer or the usage of the pens by going to a single source. But guess what? The pens became very quick, very cheaper, and actually with a better supplier that was able to deliver on time. So sometimes it's small yards. And I think what I found was finding examples like that, albeit relatively small, they multiply up very, very quickly because, one pen is not very big. But when you do a bigger organization, many pens in different global locations, standard specification results in a multiplier effect and the value grows. And then the really easy example to talk to other people about their areas of spend to improve visibility and transparency.
Yeah, I've two examples maybe from my side, and I fully agree. I think stationery is a really nice example, and pens. Two things I encounter quite a few times are one, for example, in the manufacturing industry, in the MRO space, especially spare parts, you have different sites actually using same, if not similar, if not the same machinery, and therefore same spare part, but you don't have actually a consolidated view and don't, let's say, bundle and buy together. But when really looking at the data, you identify not only these similarities, but also from time to time for the same item, very different prices. So you can already internally benchmark and without even, I think, when harmonizing, when bundling, get even additional, but just by comparing prices already a first effect. And one other point that I had very recently with a food manufacturer, we looked at not only the price point, but we looked at specifications for really, yeah, I would put it maybe simpler indirect category labels. And we had over 100 different labels for very similar packagings. And when we looked at it, we just saw that labels differed in formats just in millimeters. So you had one label 50 times 49 millimeters, then you had one 51 times 50. So really minimal differences. And we identified that this was not needed nor intended, but while producing these labels with an agency together with marketing, there was never a real database on look at, which specifications do we already have in place. And when you just look a little bit deeper into category and also how things are being produced, for example, label producing this this initial setting up cost of a machine where you define the format of a certain label are a significant part of the total price in the end, depending of the volume. So really just harmonizing formats to 5 millimeter differences rather than one resulted in really double digits of savings in percent. So,
and I think sort of culturally, which is it's really important because there is a perception sometimes that there are. I think you use the word maverick in your report at various points. it's
Yeah.
usually unintended consequences, my experience. This is not individuals who, there are some occasions where people have their favorite, particularly in professional services, their favorite supplier and their favorite contacts. I'm sure we'll come back to that later. But in most cases, it's just because they don't know, they don't understand the process to follow. They don't understand the value of harmonization. And there's a lack of planning and immediacy. So something that isn't well planned through leads to an immediate thing which has to be done now. And as a result, you end up having quite big frictional cost. And I'm sure in your labels example and my very my
Mhm.
pen example, there's no deliberate reason to do this. There
Yeah.
was no sort of Machiavellian behavior beneath this.
Yeah.
It was just a lack of process, a lack of understanding, and ultimately cost leakage. And cost leakage ultimately leads to low performance and ultimately limits reinvestment back in probably their areas they want in the first place.
Yeah. Agree. This is fully on this working basis. I agree on that. So, what we also saw in the research is that indirect spend is becoming more and more a board level issue. At the same time, many organizations struggle to link these, let's say, indirect spend to strategic priorities, which are often with higher direct spend categories. What approaches have you, Richard, seen that genuinely work to align a spend with those strategic goals?
Yeah, I think you have to go back to, I think, probably two things really. I think one is why are boards more interested now than maybe they used to be? I think, you know, given the economic environment we've all operated in the last, say, 10 years, where inflation's been more challenging, growth has been harder to get. And I'm taking a very macro view globally. If you're in the UK consumer business, it's much more extreme than it would be maybe if you were growing in the Middle East, for example. But the context of geopolitical challenges, lower growth generally, and higher inflation has resulted in much more focus on cost efficiency and transformation programs over the last 10 years. And you've seen that really and I'm sure you've got lots of examples of the work you've done to help support businesses. I think the low hanging fruit have all gone in most organizations. So I think the days of, well, we must look at our COGS, they're gone. People have negotiated their main product lines, they've harmonized their ranges. And I think the reality is there's more opportunity now because the prize is that's still there in many organizations to go after indirect spend. And therefore, ultimately, back to your strategic priorities, the strategic priority has always been to improve your operating model in some way, shape, or form. It sits on most board agendas. In fact, every board I've sat on for the last 20 years, irrespective of sector, and this does include things like education and charities, they've had to have an increased focus on how to make our operating model more efficient, more effective. And therefore, that strategic priority just has different ingredients. 10 years ago, that ingredient was very much how can we make labor more efficient? How can we buy our main products cheaper? Um, because those have run their course to a great extent. Still, there are opportunities in many organizations, but the lion's share has gone. You can't consolidate your supply chain. So I'll give you an example in food retailing. If I go back, crikey, 20 years, um, I was working in a major UK food retailer, global food retailer, but very much in the UK business. And there was a concept of how do we consolidate branded meat products under one house. And as a consequence, all the meat products were consolidated under one supplier and all the growth came from that one supplier. Major renegotiation, massive cost base, really putting the foot in the kind of controlling the hand of the retailer away from the supplier. All the branded stuff just went, you know. And if you go to most retailers now, you won't find much branded meat products. It's mainly own label because of that journey. But you can only do it once. You can't do it time after time after time. With indirect spend, because the nature of that changes frequently, it's an opportunity that keeps on giving opportunities to improve. So I think boards now are really focused on continue their operational efficiency. It's more heightened now than it was 10 years ago. But this is an area where actually they can take bigger opportunities.
And coming back to Maverick spend, and we have one particular or quite a chapter on in our paper that shows that 90% of leaders see Maverick buying as a major contributor to cost leakage. I think you touched upon it briefly before, but what forms of maverick behavior have you seen most often in practice and in your line of work?
So I think there's the maverick but not Machiavellian group, and they're those who just don't understand the process, don't understand the benefits, and once the line is shone upon them and the process improved, it improves. You then have the I know better group, which is they again they lack education. And I think educating the broader organization on procurement and supply chain is critically important. And most organizations fail to do that. They leave it to the specialists. Many people on this call will know that their job is procurement. You just procure things, and there's a lack of education. So a couple of real examples on that. What one is, I've got my favorite supplier who I worked with in my previous organization on professional services. I trust that person. They're great. I'm going to use them, and never really understanding the other services available, particularly prevalent in consultancy, usually a big issue, um, prevalent in financial services, legal services, to a great extent. What we found by having a proper process in place, by involving the budget owner, but actually bringing different people to, in this case, pitch, because they were quite big accounts. Um, they were opened up to many more opportunities to improve their network. And as a result, two things happened. One is they became much broader with their understanding of the spend area they were after. They got lots of free advice because the pitch process, as many people in this call know, is a great way to get market intel. So you got more market intel, and guess what? The price came down. In this case, they actually stayed with the incumbent supplier, interestingly. But that partners sharpened their pencils both in terms of the service they provided, but also the cost base in which um, they're procuring. And then you have the other side, which is, and this one is used the most difficult, is where somebody believes they can buy something cheaper than somebody else. So, and that's something I've come across numerous times in every organization when I put in place indirect spend programs. The first defense is, wow, well, yeah, but I can get it. I can buy it cheaper. The best price you can get that item for is this, and I can get it cheaper. And what they tend to fail to understand is they tend to give away two or three things in that journey. And there are typically three things that I've seen where once you educate people, um, in most cases, they will change their view. So one is specification. They'll trade off specifications. They don't really know the specification they're trying to get to. And as a consequence, they'll trade price off against it. Now, that's a danger the other way as well. Sometimes procurement functions are guilty of buying below spec cheaper products. And of course, that gets a bad rap. And as a consequence, guess what? Budget owners get wary about that. So agreeing the specification really clearly up front. And it can be something very simple, like a pen, should be easy to do, or a complex piece of machinery is really important. The second area is where they don't really understand the lifetime. It's one of the questions actually, the lifetime cost. So, you know, particularly in equipment, and I think you described your experience in food manufacturing, Adi, and I think my more recent experience, building kitchens for pubs. Um, you know, you put a kitchen in, it lasts for a long time, but if you're not careful, you buy a very cheap piece of kit and you're forever maintaining and servicing it. So really understanding how much the initial cost is and how much the additional cost you're going to incur over the life of that piece of kit is really, really important. And it's not prevalent for everything. Guess what? With a pen, it's disposable. You don't worry about it. But with a piece of equipment, you need to know the upfront cost and then the regular maintenance cycle. So it's usually preventative maintenance in many cases, but also the history of breakdown and what you have to spend to make sure that item is repairable and available for use. And particularly in food manufacturing, in fact, most manufacturing, a piece of kit goes back down, there isn't redundancy. So explaining that is also a really important point and why people are maverick. The third one, which really the hardest ones, who just think they know better. Um, and usually you manage that by controlling process. So, simple process, approved supplier list um, is one which many organizations still don't do today, which I find absolutely crazy. So approved supplier list. Secondly, purchase orders before order. And again, I often hear, well, that can't work with this type of spend. There are very few exceptions, and I've done this now in four organizations, whereby putting proper discipline on purchase orders in, with an emergency order mechanic, which involved me as CFO, and guess what? Not many people want to come to me with an emergency, and therefore they plan better, is really, really important. And 95% of spend, I believe, can be done with a PO, including IT contracts, including professional services. If you need to pull down a lawyer at an emergency, you just have a fixed rate you've already agreed up front. So you negotiate on the variability of the time, not the rate. And absolute discipline, absolute reporting. The extreme version of that in two of the organizations where I still had indiscipline, I agreed, and I was CFO around the board table. So this wasn't being delegated out at the board, that if people didn't use a PO, we wouldn't pay the delivery. And I communicated that to, in this case, it was 7,000 suppliers. So I wrote to them all saying, you need to understand this is an important part of our process to manage our spend. You are a valued a valued supplier. No PO, no pay. It was remarkable. Within about 2 months, I was getting feedback from suppliers saying, can you help us? Because your internal team somewhere in the organization aren't doing a PO, and I'm not going to accept the order. And that, you sort of carrot and stick the behavior. So really important process, clear on specification and education. Most people in the organization, once you educate people, have good process, will tend to follow it.
Thanks, Richard. You gave quite a few examples on categories, but just to make sure that so a lot of these things that are said are, let's say, I think very applicable also to other, let's say, categories in indirect spend. But I'm happy to deep dive into some examples, especially if the listeners have some questions. But for example, we have not spoken about yet is professional services. From my point of view, actually a very underestimated, if not to some point, and in some organizations even misunderstood maybe category. What I very often see there is that it can be a category that is very relationship driven, depending on, of course, the subcategory we talk about is legal advice, consulting, or whatsoever. It can become due to certain events or triggers, or even or projects urgent, and therefore with all these peculiarities. It's a category that often is being tried to bypass some of these controls. And it's also a thing to very interesting look at. But happy to deep dive into this later if any questions on this come up. But before we maybe go to the Q&A, I had just one last question that I would like to follow up with you on. And this is pipelining and prioritization, Richard. So the report shows that most organizations have a review pipeline, but many in the end fail to execute on it. So in your experience, what distinguishes a meaningful cost-saving pipeline from a long list of just unprioritized ideas?
I think there's I suggest probably two approaches. One is always have a long-term target, so you know what you're aiming for. So many organizations don't have a long-term view of what they're trying to achieve. So, have an expectation in terms of either cost saving, or efficiency improvements. And it could be either or, by the way. It's not always about cost. It could be improved efficiency by getting products to you quicker on better credit terms, whilst perhaps giving away something in terms of price might be the right answer. So have a multi-pronged approach. And then secondly, have a governance group that actually own this. And that's got to include typically three types of people. It's got to include budget owners, those who actually spend the money. It's got to include the procurement function, who own the processes, mechanics, and thirdly, in the finance function, to make sure that the things align to the corporate expectations and corporate targets. I've always, over the years, had a multi-year rolling conversation. So not just having what we need to do to hit the numbers this year, but what's it over 3 or 4 years. And that usually brings into play normal contract cycles. So when do contracts come up for review, rather than just forgetting about it? And it's much easier on direct, by the way. Indirect is harder, but you have to focus on the bigger areas of indirect on contract cycles. Secondly, is having roundtables with team members. on a regular basis. You tend to find your teams will know more where leakage is than maybe you sit around the board table. And that's a regular thing, including if you have a business which is multi-site or dispersed, going out and talking to people. And thirdly is the tracker and tying it to people's objectives. And those three things typically give you a multi-year program of both longer-term savings and short-term savings as well. Finally, reporting it through to the board. If the board has set an objective, if the board can see traction against that, they'll reinforce it through their own sort of team meetings, particularly executive boards, through their own team meetings. And then finally, it needs a champion. And it can be different organizations. I've always championed it personally in the organization I have as a senior board director. But in some organizations, I've seen COOs champion this, not CFOs. In a very consumer-facing business, I once saw CMO, a chief marketing officer, actually champions, which is quite refreshing because they tend to be huge spenders without as much discipline or control. So that was equally important. The final stream is to make sure you have a clear line of sight about how you improve your process and your controls, and that covers everything, whether it's IT, whether it's professional services, or whether it's the more, let's call, traditional areas of indirect spend.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So I would suggest we slowly move to a few questions that have been raised in the chat. So thanks, everyone. There are quite a few questions coming through. Thanks, everyone, for the interaction. So just to quote, there's been question on the statement, focusing on buying sometimes cheaper might give a short-term win, but taking a TCO, total cost of ownership approach is the only way to ensure savings get realized over the long term. So the question is if we can further explain TCO in this context. So I think Richard did it briefly, but on a really practical example, let me give two. One could be like a company car, or another example could be a copying machine. So while you can compare the initial price for a certain machine or item, you need to look for the whole cost of the duration, maintenance, refurbishments, or whatever is needed. For example, for a copying machine, can you use it 5 or 7 years? How much does a toner of ink cost? So you can actually break it down into an output cost. For example, to break it down, how much does one printed paper cost you over the whole life cycle? The same on cars, right? You can compare buying I don't know. I'm sorry, but since I'm from Germany, let me take a German example. You can say, BMW 4 line is more expensive than the BMW 3 line, but also what you need to take into account is really which fuel you use. Do you rather drive longer or short distances? And then you can actually break it down into cost per kilometer, and this would be like an output-driven figure where it's a lot more accurate to compare.
I think the thing I'd probably add to that is, and this is where technology will help. What I've seen with more so equipment, photocopy is a relatively simple example, but if you go to a more complex piece of equipment, when you're buying bigger parts for factories or for businesses, is the advent of technology, the Internet of Things, AI is helping to predict the lifetime cost much easier. Because one of the things I often hear is, well, I don't know if I'm buying a piece of kit that's lasted 20 years, how much it's going to cost me. The data sets are becoming much richer, and I think therefore the ability to evaluate that is much it's becoming easier. I think over the next 2 or 3 years, the concept of lifetime cost will be much easier than it has been in the past, and I think there is a need for procurement professionals, particularly procurement professionals, through their process to start to adapt how they think about sort of taking on board new contracts and new products as they sort of build in this new technology.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. I see other questions coming in. So, for example, now one very recent, where do you think organizations consistently overestimate their level of spend discipline? So what I tend to see more and more is that there is an overestimation in compliance with existing contracts. So only because there is a contract in place, which is good, right? Having a contract, the framework in place is good, but I think it's something that also needs to be challenged from time to time. If I see a contract that is 3, 4, 5 or more years old, it should just be a framework that is actually not any more accurate. Maybe even the specs of this contracts and the content is not right. And this is, I think, something that should be checked. Yeah. And also, just because a contract exists, it does not mean that people are using it. So really also checking, is the content in the contract really being utilized?
I think in addition, the areas which are overestimated, the areas where they're slightly more complex, because there's a belief that the budget owners understand their areas really well and are doing the right thing. And I think, my experience, the areas where you get significant spend and almost need an additional lens, partly because they are specialist areas. Professional services is one, because everybody has a favorite professional service company, and it's usually quite dispersed. Marketing has become materially more complex with the advent of digital spend and digital channels. And then thirdly is IT. And if you think about those three areas, they tend to have specialists in those areas who understand that area spend or the need for that spend really, really well. What I found is those are areas where it's best not to have a procurement professional buying for people, but working hand in glove with the business owners. So the professional processes that procurement professionals bring and the finance professionals bring their approaches into those parts of the business. And again, you apply the same principles of good control, good process, engaging in the conversation means better outcomes, because it's not usually in those areas a desire to buy the most expensive thing or the wrong thing, but sometimes they lack the professional frameworks to make the right decisions. I think what's also really interesting is, and this has changed, and I say this from a degree of seeing and looking at transformation in my last business, which was primarily digital and refocused marketing. And then I was responsible, and I forgot to mention in my brief, I also owned the technology function in both Greene King and Mothercare, so responsible for IT delivery. I think those areas become even more complex for those who run them. So, those who are familiar with IT 10 years ago will not understand IT today. So there's a need for much more planning and working together to identify the areas of potential spend and understanding the suppliers, and the supply base is changing fundamentally in those two areas. And therefore, more investment up front is critically important. And I think that's something which will become more of an opportunity for procurement professionals and finance professionals over the next 2 or 3 years, because the old experts are no longer the experts.
Another one was, and I think I already touched upon it briefly, but maybe Richard, you might want to add something to it, is what category of indirect spend do you believe is most misunderstood or underestimated? From my point of view, it would be actually professional service, because it is a very, put it that way, diversified category, or very different, mostly labor-driven subcategories. And as I said, it's very relationship-driven, I would say, and not always, often, but not always in the same phases recurring, but sometimes can be very, event or project-driven and therefore urgent. Would you agree, or do you have another maybe example that you could put out?
I probably agree, actually. I think if you think about the nature of professional services, it's very, very wide, and it does cover everything from routine activity on one hand, like an audit, for example, all the way through to program management and program delivery. And then you have the challenge of tip and ladling your own resources with professional services. And do you use your own resources, or do you use contractors, or do you use professional service to deliver outcomes? So I think it's complicated in terms of its nature, but I think the same rules still apply. If it's well planned, and it's thought through in advance, and you involve the right people, the budget holder, the professional procurement team, who bring you discipline, and the finance team actually to put the rigor around the evaluations, you will always get better outcomes.
Yeah, Richard. So one more that just came in: how can procurement and finance work together more effectively to close the gap between intent and execution?
I mean, one is working together on process. I mean, finance tend to deal with the back end of working with suppliers, sort of, receipting and then paying, as well as setting targets. And the procurement professionals own the process of supplier process, tendering, and managing the transactions up front. So I think if they can, it depends how they see their objectives. If their objectives are aligned about delivering an efficient process that procures products and services at the right time, whilst driving efficiency, if that's a common objective, that drives unity. Where they're very separate structurally, it makes it harder. So I sit in a slightly odd world where I had direct accountability for both. Therefore, they're very, very lined up, shall we say. But creating that, having a board sponsor across both is really important, even if they don't report to the same board director, but having one sponsor is really important.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, to add to that, maybe. So I think, process is important, and especially agreeing with finance on topics like baseline, savings measurement, and savings booking. So you really speak the same language and don't start from zero again. And I think working together, reviewing spend together and regularly, rather than working in isolation, I think, well, goes for most stakeholders with procurement, but especially with finance, I would say. And I've been just kindly informed by my colleague that we are almost coming to an end. So let me just thank you, first of all, Richard, for your time, your participation, your insights today. And thanks to everyone for joining the webinar today.